Well, yesterday we talked about how we went to Guangzhou and then stayed overnight, and then we went to Shenzhen because it's easy to travel from Guangzhou to Shenzhen. The distance is rather quite close. And today we will talk about the part about difficulty going through customs. On the 15th of June, we arrived at Shenzhen Customs. We went through the Luohu Customs in Shenzhen. When we were getting our passports checked, some difficulties arose. At first, everything went rather quite smoothly and easily, but someone noticed some problems with our passports. He pointed out that when we traveled to India back in 1990, we got our stamps to travel abroad, but when we returned from abroad back to China, we didn't get our stamps. What he pointed out was correct because we traveled to India from Lhasa, and then when we returned with His Holiness Pinda Rinpoche. I wrote about that journey in my previous biography. Back then, when we traveled back from Nepal, it was easy to travel back, and we can get temporary passports as long as we pay them some money. Pinda Rinpoche back then needed to perform some Vajra dances of Padmasambhava, and then he told us that it would be easy for us to get a temporary passport. So when we come back, originally our passport was green, and then we got a white temporary passport. That's the one that we carried all the way from Nepal to Hong Kong and Hong Kong to Chengdu. So Hong Kong to Guangzhou and Guangzhou to Chengdu. Anyhow, at that time, the stamps were stamped on our temporary passports all the way from Hong Kong. And back at that time, that was a rather very common practice because we wanted to ship back some of the Buddha statues that we purchased abroad. However, when we tried to explain this with the customs officers, they insisted on reporting to their superiors still, so they kept on calling their superiors and managers while taking us to a separate room. It happened to me again much later, when I wanted to travel from Hangzhou. When I arrived at Hangzhou, my luggage had already flew to other country, but I couldn't get across the borders. Anyhow, when we were all locked up in a room, Phuntsok Rinpoche was sitting on a high chair, on a rather tall chair, and all of us requested Phuntsok Rinpoche to grant blessings so that the problems we can overcome this problematic situation. And Phuntsok Rinpoche said that when we were in Bhutan, Marpa, the protector, had promised that at times when you have problems, you can call me and I would come right away. So Phuntsok Rinpoche thought about that promise given by Marpa. So he started to supplicate to Padmasambhava, King Gesar, and the protectors. We noticed that Phuntsok Rinpoche was chanting silently and staring into the space in front. After a little while, the customs officer came back, and his attitude had a big turnaround. He said that, well, your situation is complicated, but we still will let you go through the borders. Within this whole process of going through the customs, I really feel that the blessings of Phuntsok Rinpoche, of the protectors, are really really great that influenced such person or influenced a situation where it had a great turnaround. Because sometimes I would contemplate that if we cannot go abroad this time, it would be difficult. And the customs officer was rather very stern and very stubborn about keeping us in the room and not letting us to go. However, after the chanting, after Pengsu Rinpoche grand blessings, everything just changed. After we smoothly crossed the borders, we then arrived in Hong Kong and we stayed overnight at the point center of Pengsu Rinpoche again. On the second morning, Pengsu Rinpoche asked me to write down the supplication that he recited at the time of crossing borders. He said, on the border between Shenzhen and Hong Kong, I felt a little worried when it came to checking the passports. Then, in my pure meditative experience, I had a vision of wording Padmasambhava, the legendary King Gesar, and accompanied by the Dhammapala Tsarmapa. Witnessing them, I prayed in such a way. Well, we had no idea that Pengsu Rinpoche had the protectors in his pure vision. The supplication, right? The supplication reads the three secret qualities of all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in infinite pure realms are embodied in you. In your presence, O Padmasambhava, to you I devoutly pray grand blessings so that all our wishes will be spontaneously fulfilled. Your wisdom, compassion, and power have reached perfection. Your loving care for the beings of snow, for the snowland, as your only child, you, the Dharma of accomplishment, please look upon us and grant blessings so that all our aims may be easily accomplished. This is the king of this is King Gesar, because he's the Dharma, the Lord of warriors. And then he continued to say that your compassionate response to supplication is swifter than lightning. Your way of enacting entrustment is more powerful than a thunderbolt. Yaksha Tumarpo, king, enemy, subduer, destroy all negative forces and obstacles immediately. When such wholehearted supplications are made, my terrors and illusory appearances dissolve into Dharmadhatu. May all attachment to self and the deity vanish in the non-referential dhatu of Dharmakaya. Well, after chanting these this supplication, Pengsu Rinpoche stated that all the terrors and illusory appearances dissolve into Dharmadhatu. And they continue, and then at the end of this application says, Ngawang Loju Tsokme wrote down this prayer, the residence of Drupwang Pema Norbu, which is Pengsu Rinpoche in the morning of the following day. When we were in Hong Kong, Khenpo Namdro gave me this yellow shirt and a donka. He said that it was brought back from India. The quality of this cloth is really good. I've been wearing this for 30 years, and I had this I was wearing this, attended many empowerments and teachings of Pengsu Rinpoche. So in order to represent the dependent arising, I am currently wearing this yellow shirt as well as donga. Whenever I go abroad and give teachings, I would carry this cloth and would wear it. Marpalotawa, when he wears some of those really old clothes, some of the disciples would say that, well, I thought you have lots of wealth, so why do you wear such old and beaten up clothes? He said that at times of requesting Dharma teachings and receiving Dharma teachings in India, Narupa was giving me the Hivajra empowerment, and this is the shirt I wore when I received that empowerment. So I am simply learning from the great masters. When I was writing this, I thought that many people would probably feel that everything is like a dream, like illusion. Why do you hold on to these two clothes? But I think maybe it's because of my faith, and sometimes I would write whatever I remember. This particular way of writing does not fit into the habit of the Tibetans. When I was writing the previous biography, I was writing it in the habit of a Chinese reader. And then later, when it was translated, I think it may not be very easy for the Tibetans to accept this particular style. But I think different people, different ethnics, and they may have very different ways of understanding it. But I think maybe because of the Western culture's impact, it could be easy for people to accept it now, or easier. On the 16th, which is the second day, we flew over the Pacific Ocean. Back at the time when Pansukho Rinpoche went abroad, the relations between different countries are not as open as what we have now. I think Pansukho Rinpoche and we were probably the first group of Tibetans from Tibet to travel abroad and give Dharma teachings. I don't think I'm bluffing about it. I mean, there were Tibetans traveling from Nepal and India, but I think directly from Tibet must be quite rare back then. Back in the 80s, that is. I heard, at the time of traveling, I heard that Hawaii it was summertime in Hawaii and it was really hot. So I prepared some of the appropriate clothing for Pansukho Rinpoche, also a very good luggage. Because of my previous experience of traveling to India, back then we didn't have very good bags. But now we had more experiences of going abroad, so we prepared a good luggage and didn't prepare too much of tsampa and butter. On the 16th of June, we flew 4 hours from Hong Kong to Tokyo International Airport. There was a little bit of a time change, but I didn't really record it, but I think maybe there's a little bit of a difference. Anyhow, when we arrived at the airport of Japan, my feeling was that the Japanese airport looks like a crystal palace. It was crystal clear, without any dust even on the ground, and it was very bright. I feel like I could see my shadows or myself. My image is completely reflected on the ground. Back then, I really felt like I arrived in paradise. Though I went to Bhutan, Nepal, and India, but those airports were not, it cannot compare to that of the Japan's. The airport was not as bad as some of the African countries now, but still compared to Japan, it was very different. I think that was my first time seeing a developed country. It really felt like a mundane being who first take a glimpse of Sukhavati. Though I didn't write Sukhavati in my book because I don't want to be laughed at, but I was thinking like that. After we arrived Tokyo International Airport, I felt in such a way. Back in 1915, I went to Europe and Africa, and also on the way back to China, I went to Tokyo again. I stayed in Tokyo for a few days. I had a few classes in Tokyo University and so on, and also given a few public speeches. But the feelings was rather very similar. Ponzo Rinpoche didn't stay very long in Japan, and we stayed at a hotel right outside of the airport. There were a few people who studied Tibetan Vajrayana, the Eastern Vajrayana, and so on. Ponzo Rinpoche gave them some teachings on wisdom and compassion, and specifically spoke about Buddhism and science. Though time was short, Ponzo Rinpoche specifically spoke about how science and Buddhism to human beings are both necessary, because when it comes to science, it could fulfill the needs of the material needs of humans. However, Buddhism could bring the true benefit that surpass of the materialistic world, and could bring great benefits to sentient beings in this life and future lifetimes. Without Buddhism, if one were to only seek for materialistic provisions, then it could bring suffering. After Ponzo Rinpoche gave the teachings to them, the audience really felt that they were very much inspired, and their expressions, their attitude towards Ponzo Rinpoche were very different. After a few decades, I encountered a few of them who met Rinpoche back then, and they said that after meeting Ponzo Rinpoche, even for once, their feelings had never changed even after a few decades, and the way and their attitude and their mind, their faith towards Buddhism is still very firm. After that, we flew from Tokyo to Hawaii. Ponzo Rinpoche took the economy seats, or economy flight to Hawaii. That is why, though I had many opportunities to go abroad, afterwards I had never wanted to take the business class, because even Ponzo Rinpoche had never took the business class for once when he was traveling. For whatever reason back then, when we were flying on the American flight, we didn't get any food, any meals, and the air hostess, all of those servers on the air flights were all middle-aged, which were different than the Chinese flight back then. Ponzo Rinpoche needed to take some medication back then and needed hot water. So back then, the first English word that I learned by myself was hot water. So I finally was able to use that, and I really felt quite successful. When we were flying over the Pacific Ocean, at first, it really felt really beautiful. And I was mesmerized by the flight. But after flying for 7 to 8 hours, I really felt it was a bit lonely, somewhat lonesome, because it was such a small island. I also remembered looking at Ponzo Rinpoche, since I was sitting right beside him. Whenever I take flights, those kinds of memories would strike back. Ponzo Rinpoche didn't speak much, but he would look outside the window, and sometimes he would use his red mala beads. Sometimes he looked like he's praying, sometimes he looked like he's contemplating and thinking. thinking. He didn't really speak much anyhow. That was the state we were in at that time. It was very special time. Now it takes us about 2-3 hours to fly from Shanghai to Beijing, and back then it took us 7 hours to fly from Tokyo to Hawaii. Many people, after taking for 4 to 5 hours, they would feel quite tired. But Phuntsok Rinpoche, who didn't travel much and didn't have a great health, he took such a long time on the flight. And then afterwards, finally we arrived at the airport.
好，今天讲到这里。